There are a lot of H abilities in EU4, 44 to be exact, so it's time to rank them in the only objective way possible, a tier list. Before we begin, quick round of disclaimers. As always, we'll be discussing both multiplayer and single player here, and in both cases, I'm assuming that you're trying to play optimally, since if we're not assuming optimal play, well, the tier list don't matter, because nothing is better or worse than what you do. With that said, if there is a massive discrepancy between single player and multiplayer, I'll naturally talk about it as well. For the unique modifiers, I'm going to assume you have access to it, and hence rank it accordingly. I believe that's the best way of doing it, because say, for example, you're playing Poland, well, the fact that Australia doesn't have access to your unique age ability doesn't make it worse for you. With that said, before we get into it proper, a like on the video would be appreciated if you haven't already, and a subscription would be amazing. We're really close to 14k now, and hitting that would be great. With that self-shitting out of the way though, it's time for the tier list, and before we actually get into this, I'm just going to give a little mini preemptive thing. A lot of the buffs here are going to be really, really strong, and that means that usually, compared to other tier lists that I've done before, I would be less harsh than I would be here, simply because the competition within this list is, quite bad. And there's literally 5% admin efficiency on the line here, right? I'm going to be a lot harsher than I normally would be for modifiers. A similar thing can actually be found in the tier list I did for the unique units. Like, a lot of the unique units I ended up marking quite harshly down. A lot of people didn't like, for example, the Cossacks, because it's only 15% shock damage. That's still really strong, but within the context of every other special unit, that's not great. And I think it's going to be happening a lot here as well today, because a lot of these modifiers are absolute monsters. So comparatively, there's going to be things going into the lower tiers that are just going to be there because of the relative, advantages and disadvantages. So that's not to say that these things are inherently bad. None of these bonuses give you any debuffs for taking them at the end of the day, right? But that's to be said. Anyway, the first thing we have on the list is, well, the fun edict you unlock in the starting age, the Age of Discovery. That is the Feudal de Jure law. That's going to give you -5 unrest and edict form. Honestly, and it's going to sound a bit weird, but I think that's surprisingly underrated. The reason is, early game, you're probably not going to be pushing your country that much simply because you don't have the capacity to push it that much. Because if you do start taking things like 5,000 overextension, you are going to die to both aggressive expansion and you're going to die to the rebels. So you tend to be pushing your country less, but that can lead to situations where you actually only get 3 or 4 unrest, and can get a pretty big revolt out of it, say 30,000-40,000 troops if you have, for example, particular strikes out around your country. Being able to slap on the Feudal de Jure edict while you're quarrelling or something, in some cases, to like micro revolts can actually be pretty underrated as an ability. Of course, it's not going to prevent like a -15 unrest province from uprising and so on, and you can't really run it that much, but it does allow you to focus down within specifically stated land quite a bit of unrest, and I think it's really not used as much as it can be. I guess part of that is a lot of the other age abilities within this age are quite good as well, so there's a lot of competition for the spender points in the early game. This is kind of also made up for the fact that a lot of the early game spender bonuses, you can kind of build up spender, like you can plan for spender for the later ages, in the sense that you can preemptively start competing the conditions to have them met for when the age starts. And you can also start basically getting buffs to spender generation, because there's now quite a few things that give you buffs to spender generation that used to not really exist. Like, Yeti Spender wasn't really a buff that got given out, but now there's like 5 monuments to do it. You can go grab court ideas or even some innovative ideas, have spender generation inside of it. So, like, there are ways of getting more spender later on. So early on especially, Feudal de Jure Law has a lot of competition for it, but at the same time, it can be quite useful to just prevent, if you're microing, a lot of revolts, and early on that can be quite helpful. It's still not the greatest though, but overall I think it's not actually taken enough for what it provides. Like, it's not great, but it's not as bad as its usage rate from my personal experience would lead you to believe. So for that kind of reasoning, and I guess it is quite a harsh tier list, I think it'll be going to near the top of C tier. I think it's been really held back by being, well, in competition with a lot of other age bonuses early on. But yeah, I can't be putting it higher than C, really. But yeah, with that, we move on to Justified Wars. It's the aggressive expansion icon, but green, because it makes your expansion give you negative AE. No, it doesn't. But it does decrease AE by 10%. 10% isn't great, but it's great for stacking it if you're trying to stack with other AE reductions, and especially with aggressive expansion. You basically just want to avoid getting to 50 or get people out of coalitions. So if Justified Wars is the difference between having France in a coalition and not, then obviously it's amazing. It can let you get quite a bit more land in that regard, and yeah, it's just a very useful thing. It tends to grab quite early for a lot of the early expansions and a lot of early wars, because again, If you're blobbing early, it's incredible, and there's very hard ways to go around saying, like, it's very hard to justify against it. The other thing as well to bear in mind is aggressive expansion becomes less relevant later on into the game as you become stronger, so even if everyone in the world forms a coalition against you, that doesn't matter because you can still win. Within the start of the game, the first age, that's not really the case most of the time, so you want to be avoiding aggressive expansion anyway, and this obviously helps with that quite a bit. If you are also stacking it with, for example, max prestige or well, I would have said influence ideas, but they've moved the pulse event down to espionage now, so just basically taking espionage ideas and things like that, you can really start to mitigate a lot of AE impact from that going forward. So as part of those kinds of builds, it's really strong. In just general play, it's really strong, helps you avoid coalitions. It's just a really good age ability. And while I think there's the better things later on, I think its utility for being really early on, and its, and its early access in terms of mitigating aggressive expansion, like, I like to make fun of AE somewhat in that, aggressive coalitions don't really matter, but coalitions do matter, they're just very manageable if you really micro them and really know what you're doing. And the thing is with this specifically, this age ability, is this is one of the tools you have to manage your coalitions. Like, coalitions are scary, you just have to know how to manage them, for lack of a better word, and don't be an idiot with them. And the way you don't be an idiot is the Sage ability, so for that reason I think it's earned a space in S tier. With that though, we move on to Transfer Subject. Goddamn amazing utility ability, allows you to nick subjects, and it allows you to take them at half cost, and allows you to fabricate claims bordering claims. The claims bordering claims lets you get loads of really useful CBs, especially for things like Austria if you're trying to get some claims on some stupid province that's, flipped away religion-wise for the Age of Reformation, you're trying to stop the Reformation. It's incredibly useful to try and get CBs on annoying people. It's just an amazing utility tool, and I would say it's not, I'd say it's underrated, but it's an amazing utility tool that, within my experience, people play with quite as well. So I won't even say it's underrated. Now, it is pure utility. It doesn't give you your country any flat buffs. It just is another tool that allows you to use it, right? At the end of the day, just having a better hammer doesn't mean that you just automatically get a bigger house, right? But it does let you build better houses. So it's not like it has an immediate stat increase in the same way that Justifies Wars just straight up gives you less aggressive expansion flat. So that's, a weird one in that regard. But at the same time, the utility of it, I think, is pretty hard to understate. So for me, Transfer Subject will be going into A tier, because I think the utility of it is pretty nice. But I just think it's very tough to be an S tier for this tier list. With that said, though, if this was a national idea or something, it'll be going up in S, to be clear. But again, it's tough competition here. And with that, we move on to improved war taxes, free war taxes. These things are good. Basically, when you're at war, you turn these guys on and you're happy. Now, there is a bit of a, I guess, misnomer or skill issue with them, and I suffer from it constantly myself, and that is you forget to turn off your free war taxes at the end of the age. I'm not sure if there is actually a pop about it. I think this was talked about. Don't get me if I'm wrong, remind me if I'm wrong. But there might be a thing that you have, expensive war taxes might actually be a pop-up, but if it's not a thing in the game yet, it's a very requested feature. That's because you do just forget to turn this thing off. Within my experience of EU4, I've lost way too many mill points burning away mill taxes. But with that said, the reason I still take it and still do it is because it is good. It reduces, just having war taxes on it reduces your army maintenance quite significantly, and there's quite a few times as well where I would be like, okay, I'm actually at peace, but I've got free war taxes, I kind of want to be at war, so I'm saving money on my troops, because I need to be paying for them to fight rebels and other things like that, so it can genuinely be worth taking them early. The other thing with them as well is, yeah, they do run out at the end of the age, but if you really want to run free war taxes, there's a bunch of monuments, for example, accepting the Japanese culture and just building up that monument in Japan is an option for minus 100%, and there's a couple government reforms, or even playing, for example, France and taking war economy, because you have 50% in your ideas and 50% in the government reform to be able to run free war taxes, so that's, neat, but I think early on it's also very nice, and it's early money, so it's great for scaling. Again, it's a really nice, strong early ability, and for that reason, it's going to be going to A tier as well. Now we move on to cavalry armies. Gives you 20% cavalry to infantry ratio. This one is weird. This was any kind of national idea or whatever of that form. I think it'll be really useful because it's going to help you get to that cavalry build. It allows you to get to 100% cav to infantry ratio, which is somewhere you want to be. The problem, of course, is it kind of runs out at the end of the age. So building around it is just asking for trouble. And you can make a build where you basically prevent the Age of Reformation firing ever. And the optimal way of doing that is basically annexing every single Catholic. But at that point, like, if you manage to annex every single Catholic to keep the Reformation down and so on and so forth, well, you probably don't need the captivity ratio. And when you do get it that early, it's probably a bit too early as well to actually get your captivity ratio build going, so it's a bit hard to complete any builds. It doesn't enable Muslims to run full captivity ratio, for example, because you only get 10% from Sunni, so this gets you up to, what, 30%? You're still short 20% from somewhere, and even if you take aristocratic early, you're still going to be short 10%. It doesn't really help hordes, like, for example, Tengri hordes, to run an extra 25%, because they can get 25% from Tengri, 25% from Tengri, no, basically they can't, like, synchronize, for example, Buddhist or something, and lose that last 25% ratio for being unsynchronized, because this only gives you 20, so they can't, like, get that going. It's a very awkwardly placed age ability for me in that regard, and I think, like, while numerically it's good, it really suffers from the awkwardness of its positioning and its buff, where it's very, very hard to utilize it effectively, and even if you do work really hard to utilize it effectively, well, you're going to be hitting 15-10 or whatever, and then your buff's just going to be gone, and you're going to be sad, and everyone's going to be miserable. So for that reason, I think it's going to be going into high C tier, but not much higher than that. With that, though, we move on to high developed colonies. Well, if you're colonizing it, this is incredibly strong. If you're not colonizing, you never take it. So, I mean, because you just don't take this if you're not colonizing, because there's a lot of better options within this age, a lot of the time, you just, again, don't end up taking it. But if you are taking it, it's really strong. Strong enough to get into A tier, and I think that's a pretty reasonable way to get into it. It's not going to win you the game on its own, but it's going to really help you get there. 3 extra development on all of your colonies does add up quite a bit. I think the person best able to use that is Portugal, but we'll get to Portugal in a minute, with their age ability coming up soon. But yeah, it's there. Anyway, with that, we move on to adaptive combat terrain. +1 dice roll on combat terrain as capital is very strong. It allows you to control what that terrain is to some extent by, well, moving your capital around, even though you really shouldn't. And it just gives you, on a decent chunk of the terrain in the game, a pretty nice bonus. It's basically an extra general, well, fire and shock pip, and that should not be disregarded. And don't forget that shock pip can exceed the cap, because even if you have 6 shock, in the shock phase, you're still going to get that 1+ combat bonus if you fight in your terrain. This is really strong. And all the time, if you are fighting, you're going to be taking this because of the bonuses that it provides, and you are probably going to be fighting in the early game. So for that reason, again, we have another entry into A tier. This is kind of the reason why these two, I believe, really struggle for me inside the early game, is that the early game age bonuses, a lot of them are just really, really strong. So you end up, like, not having the spender to take feudal de jure lore as well. But that's a separate debate. With that, though, we move on to the first unique one. That is the Ottoman Siegecraft, +1 leader siege. It's a leader siege pip. What's not to love? Especially for the Ottomans, now with the Guns of Urban and the other buffs that they get. I mean, the 33% siege ability they used to have was arguably a bit more insane, but this is still ridiculously good. An extra siege general pip. Siege pips are quite hard to get, and yeah, this is just a very neat bonus to have forever. It basically guarantees a leader siege pip, and if you are rolling around with it, you can get 3-4 general siege pips relatively easily as the Ottomans. I say 3-4, it's not that easy. I mean, you have to still roll a 3 siege general, but the fact it's within the realm of possibility is monstrous, and this is one of the reasons the Ottomans are able to literally conquer Europe by 1500s in an achievement kind of setup. So yeah, it is definitely up there. I think just shy of S tier because I tend to be quite harsh, but definitely an A tier as well. And the A tier is looking very crowded though. With that though, we move on to Portugal. Now, Portuguese colonial growth is very weird to rank in the sense that it is absolutely amazing for Portugal, and there's the reason that Portugal is able to be a big colonial power, because otherwise it would be just a slightly bigger Brittany. It's basically the Portuguese colonial growth is the ability, and if you are playing around as Portugal for it, yeah, you want to take that, you want to be taking your high developed colonies, and you want to just make absolute bang from the colonies. That's not exactly a hidden strategy, that's just what you do, and it's very effective at doing that. The thing is that this buff is incredibly strong as well early on, because there's not a lot of bonuses to global settlers you can increase. So the actual flat increase of 50 early on, like if it was late game, it wouldn't be that amazing, but because you get it so early, you're able to really, really utilize it. So I think for that reason, I'm going to be actually incredibly generous with this buff, because it pretty much defines Portugal as a nation, this one ability. So for that reason, it's going to be going into S tier, because again, Portugal would just be a glorified Brittany if it wasn't for this bonus when it comes to colonization. With that though, we move on to Danish subject loyalty. This one is weird, because it used to be like actually somewhat useful as Denmark because it let you hold on to Sweden a bit easier and was a bit nice in that regard. Now, if you're playing Denmark and you hold on to Sweden, just don't take the event where you massacre a bunch of the Swedish nobles in Stockholm. That's kind of it. It's entirely doable, and this age ability becomes quite unnecessary. And with a lot of the competition with everyone else around in this age, I find this ability quite genuinely sad to end up taking. Like I say frequently, I think I've played Denmark, like New Denmark, don't like the new Denmark after the updated mission tree twice, and not that extensively, just a little bit, like not a full campaign to be clear of. And I've never been in a situation where I was like genuinely struggling with Swedish or Norwegian loyalty or anything of that regard. So saying that this is useful is a lie, because it's relatively easy to maintain your liberty desire on your subjects. You don't need the -30 from the Danish thing, like, at all. It used to be nicer when you was harder, because you wouldn't have your mission trees giving you buffs for that. But again, now it's just really fallen off, and I think for that reason we have our first entry to D tier. It's also really held back by the fact that everything else in this age is so good. You want to take the AE impact, you want to take the free war tax, you want to take the combat bonus in code terrain, and because you even get some colonization going from your missions, you probably even want to take the +3 development in your colonies. So yeah, absolutely. And we also then move on to Venice to get 50% ship trade power. That's massive, that's insane. The problem is it's completely goddamn useless. It's useful if you go for the achievement where, as Venice, you're trying to get 50% of your node while having less than 20 cities or something similar to that. Outside of going for that specific achievement, you want to take the AE impact and just conquer your way there. You want to take the water access cost to conquer your way there. You want to take the adaptive combat terrain to, guess what, just again conquer your way there. You're in Italy, you're rich, you can just do that. You don't need ships trade power as Venice, like, at all, really. What you actually need is galleys to make sure that other people don't conquer you back, right? So this ability is very bad for when you're playing optimally. Now, if you're role-playing, etc., etc., oh lord, it's amazing, but I mentioned before, right in the front, that we are assuming optimal play, and with optimal play, you shouldn't be building light ships as Venice. In the most unironic way possible, like, it's a bit of a weird way that the game handles trade, for sure, but basically light ships are kind of bad at trade, because they're always more expensive than just conquering the province, or fighting it that way. Now, this is the part where I'm going to hear a lot of people, I mean, this got mentioned in the comments previously when I talked about using light ships for trade. It's like, oh, what if you're not able to conquer the land in multiplayer? Well, if you're going to nick someone's trade with light ships, all you're asking for is to get decked and then someone to move out with 50 heavies and sink your light fleet, or just get decked and get invaded, to be honest, simpler. Like, doing that is just an easy way of making enemies. People are going to notice you doing that, and they're not going to be happy in a normal competitive lobby. In a casual lobby, well, the fact, if you are able to get away with that, then that's a casual lobby, and I'm going to be putting that under the RP domain, because in a casual lobby, you're probably going to be able to get away with things like making a spy build, where you support rebels in other people's countries. Sounds like a really cool campaign, completely useless as any kind of serious lobbies, because what are they going to do? Get some extra particulars? Yeah, right. So, for that kind of reasoning, yeah, it's numerically a really nice buff. In practice, absolutely sucks. And that concludes our first Age of not the Age of Reformation, the Age of Discovery bonuses for the category, and we move on to the Age of Reformation. Now, within the Age of Reformation, it's a bit nice in the sense that, well, you probably had some time to build up and get ready to get Splendor going to pick up some age bonuses. The issue is that it's very awkward bonuses to pick up. Convert provinces, you're either doing that where you are in a situation where you're converting a lot of provinces, or you're not doing that, in which case it's quite hard to get it. I feel like the convert provinces age objective is you either happens or it doesn't. The same can be said for the humanist or religious and join the Reformation. You either go religious or humanist, or you don't. So it's not like something you can work towards. A similar thing can be capturing the colonial empire, but even weirder, because 5 colonial nations is actually quite difficult to do, even if you're doing something like Portugal. Yes, you could have 5 colonial nations out by the start of 1500s if you really, really work for it, but you're probably not, and you probably want to be colonizing things like Africa and so on. And when you are colonizing, you probably want to get your colonial nations to 10 ASAP to get their merchant out of them, and get them big enough so they can start getting colonies of their own. So you actually just very rarely have 5 colonial nations, if ever, really, when you enter this age, so it's a hard spend ability to pick up. Converting other nations is probably the one thing that you can kind of work towards grabbing. Enforcing religion on your vassals also counts towards that, and it's a pretty nice one to grab. Same thing as the convert provinces can be applied to Asian trade. You're either in Asia and you're trading in it, or you're not in Asia and you're not trading in it. And unify culture, yeah, good luck doing that if you're playing someone in Germany, for example. So it's a bit hard environment to create Splendor, but within the Age of Reformation, there is one thing I have to commend. There's a lot less useful bonuses. And of course, that would start with Religious Enforced Edict. Goddamn, this thing is useless. Because of the way that Reformations work, this doesn't prevent the Centers of the Reformation picking your provinces to convert them. They'll still pick it, they'll just take longer to do it. So it kind of slows down the Reformation, but not by any reasonable way, and not in a way that you care. Your provinces are still going to end up converted, it's just going to take a bit longer to do it. The best way to actually prevent the Reformation, get resistance to Reformation, is, if you're playing someone like a Catholic, crush the Centers of the Reformation, which is doable, but again, that's not done through this edict. So even though there's not much competition in this tier for the age abilities, this one's still going to be going into D tier. We then move on to Floating Batteries, 1 blockade impact on siege. This is the reason, this age ability is the reason you probably want to start looking into a navy right now. This really helps you siege. A +1 blockade impact on siege is incredibly helpful and is somewhat on par with the Ottoman ability. Unfortunately, it doesn't apply to non-coastal forts, and it doesn't apply everywhere, but it's incredibly nice workhorse, like middle of the pack, works around 50% of the time, and when it works, it gives you that 75% of the way to being amazingness. It's a solid B tier pick, and the first entry to B tier has now arrived. With that, though, we move on to Mercenary Discipline. Oh, sorry, we move on to Religious Wars. We move to Mercenary Discipline in a second. Now, with Religious Wars, we get war score cost versus other religions, 25% of it, and yeah, this is just really good. Like, I'm not going to beat around the bush, this is really good. This is probably one of the first things you pick up in the age. It's 25% province war score cost on non-religious people, and that's probably going to be a bunch of them, especially even if you're playing a big religion like Catholic, to be fair. There's going to be a bunch of Protestants popping out in this age, which is going to give you the war score cost on them, and even if you're not, well, you know, the world doesn't tend to be that religiously united. You can really get a lot of mileage out of this province war score cost. It's a bit of a weird toss-up for me between S and A tier, but I think the universal usefulness for this ability, for me, puts it into S tier because of just how, like, universally useful this is wherever you play in the world. You can use this thing to relatively great effect. I think the one exception of relatively popular campaigns that people play where this isn't useful is probably the Inca, because that area tends to be somewhat religiously united, at least by the time you get to this age when you are played as the Inca. So that's probably one of the few areas in the world you're not getting that much mileage out of it, but pretty much everywhere else, people tend to disagree about religion. Everywhere from Africa, you have fetishists fighting Muslims and Muslims fighting fetishists and whatever other local religions you have, animists and whatever you have locally going on there. Europe's a whole religious, like, on fire situation. India's got like 15 religions going on, just chronically, and Asia is, you know, debating between different types of Confucian, Tengri, Buddhist messes, Shintoism, all that shenanigans. Like, the entire world is basically completely in disagreement about what God is, and that's good because disagreement here means more province war score costs for you. So absolutely grab it. With that, though, we move on to Mercenary Discipline. Now, 5% discipline would be amazing if Mercenary Discipline actually worked. The honest answer is it really doesn't. And so, because of the way that Mercenary Discipline doesn't really work, it's not +5 discipline, it's basically +5 ICA. Even then, not really. I mean, I was playing an MP recently where I was like, oh wow, this age ability gives 20% Merc Discipline. I was like, yeah, but it's still kind of meh. Like, it's not great. And you also run into the issue with mercenaries, of course, by the time you're in the 1500s. Actually, this ability is, you've kind of fallen off to conventional armies, really. So you end up getting a lot less mileage out of this. You can, of course, do some cool Switzerland builds and stuff like that out of it, but I think because of its relatively nice utility for things like Switzerland, if you're really trying to stack it, and the somewhat roleplay aspect, like, I can see why people like this ability, but it's really massively held back by the fact that Mercenary Discipline just is broken in the game right now, as in it doesn't work the way it's meant to. Or at least, if it is meant to work that way, it's not communicated very well to the player. It's significantly worse than Discipline. So, yeah, just because you're broken, go into D tier until you fix, or at least summarize within how that modifier works better. With that, we move on to Powerful Trade Ships. It's like the Venetian ability, but worse. If you want to see the breakdown of why it's worse, go like 5 minutes back into the video, whenever that was, and listen to me complain about Venice. Then we move on to Institution Spread. Now, I would normally be a lot harsher if this was in the previous age. Institution Spread in True Faith Province is kind of like whatever, rounding up. But most other things in this age aren't great, and you still have access to a bit more spender generation if you happen to have access to it. So I'll be lying if I said I haven't taken this more often than I should have, simply because it was the best option available at the time. So, it's not like completely awful, but Only because the competition is so pathetic, I'll be scraping it into C tier. It's just barely getting to that C tier because I'm feeling generous. Like, I would say no to that modifier, but I'm only taking it because I have an extra 800 spender points sitting around doing not much. With that, though, we move on to prestigious conversions. This is surprisingly good, especially if you are converting a lot and you're blobbing, and even in multiplayer, you're probably not expanding into purely religiously homogenous land. You can really print a lot of prestige with this, and the other nice thing is, compared to, say, just things that let you, like, set a prestige cap, this actively generates prestige, meaning that you can spend your prestige on things like biting down Liberty Desire if that's an issue, or getting rid of heirs and other utility things. And I think that utility that I really appreciate, just having prestige income consistently from the prestige from missionaries, is very helpful. In many cases, especially for a world conquest, that is a very underrated ability, and I think especially given the not great competition this age, I think it's reasonable to put it into B tier because of its relative gain. I'm not going to put it high though, because sometimes you're going to be in a situation where this doesn't really give you much prestige, if any at all, and this is only really useful for specifically a one faith world conquest, or at least a many conversion world conquest build. If you're going for a humanist build, this isn't great for your world conquest because you're just not converting. Anyway, with that said, we move on to Spanish Field Marshals. Now, this used to be tercios. Gave you minus 30% shock damage to an entire army. Now it just gives you a leader shock. It's not bad, but it's not good either. A leader shock pip isn't awful, but come on, for an H ability, and I think I'm going to be a bit harsh towards it because I remember the old tercios, but yeah, it's could be a lot better. For that reason, I'll be putting it to B tier. It's like, it's decent, you take it a spec, you get your extra shock pips, you're happy, but it's not like a game-breaking ability as Tercios was before. Now, Spain still just has access to Tercios from their missions. Arguably, that's a lot stronger because you get to keep them after the Age of Discovery. But yeah, it's a thing. With that, though, we move on to the Mughal 50% cavalry combat ability. Very similar vein to the Spanish Field Marshals. Now, I am still a massive Mughal fanboy, so I used to curve about the old Mughal ability for the artillery cost being really good, because actually, artillery is really expensive, so the artillery cost buff lets you run more of it. No, who cares? Army is going to be expensive, and artillery cost is probably the best cost reduction modifier, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, you can just make more money, right? Like, at the end of the day, you can just make more money. It's a bit hard to just make more artillery combat ability. There's no real, like, workshop to build 1% artillery combat ability for each workshop kind of thing. That might be a cool mod to discover or something. Like, for every manufacturer, for every weapons manufacturer, you give 1% artillery, infantry, and cavalry combat ability. God, that's going to go really well, isn't it? For any super blob builds. But I digress. For 50% artillery combat ability is significantly better than the previous buff. So for that reason, I think I'll be putting it into the B tier as well, compared to the other things. Doesn't quite get into A for being that strong, but it's consistently nice. You grab it as a Mughals and you're happy with it. My other issue, of course, Age of Reformation. Only by around 1550 is artillery really starting to shine. But I guess the Mughals, you can get that going a bit earlier, and you're probably building it to siege anyway, so you may as well have that be a thing. With that, though, we move on to the Polish Crown for 33% goods produced modifier. Grab that as Poland, Commonwealth, or if you're playing the Prussian missions, or playing as, I believe, Ruthenia, you can also get access to it as well. But basically, this thing is really, really strong for your economy. It's an absolute monster. This makes Poland insanely good at money for this age specifically. This is the money printer, and money is good in this game. It's one of the better age abilities, and literally something used as an example of an amazing age ability. Yes, it's just pure money, but goddamn does it give you so much money. It's genuinely incredible. Like, at the end of the Age of Reformations, in multiplayer, countries like Austria get poorer because Poland stops producing so many goods and they start getting less downstream from them, passively. Like, Austria wasn't even actively nicking it because they probably had a deal with Poland or something of that similar. Like, it is genuinely that impactful for money. So, yeah, I think we have another S-tier contestant on our hand. With that, though, we move on to Persian Enlightenment, and dear God alive, this thing is completely broken as well. 20% dev cost just to have is incredibly strong. This age ability just gives you a free university in every province in the Age of Reformation as Persia. I mean, Persia's already busted, but one of the reasons Persia is busted is because of this age ability, and I mean, giving it anything other than S tier is just also incorrect. So yeah, we're having a very populated S tier today, but that's just kind of how the ages work. A lot of them are really strong. With that, though, we move on to the Age of Absolutism. Now, this is probably the best age, if maybe not the last one, that you can prepare for. By the time you get into it, by the 1610s, you've had well over 150 years of gameplay. you've probably had the time, if you wanted to get 5 universities, get 200 force limit, you know, get 5 different promoted cultures, or go fight the League War kind of thing. So, and eventually you'll be able to get absolutism, and if you're blobbing, you probably have 3 trade companies. So this is probably the easiest one to set up for in terms of your spender bonuses and spender generation. And this is also around the time you're going to be able to afford your great projects to, if you want to build those for spender and things like that as well. So at this point, the spender generation is going to be picked up quite a bit, so you're going to be able to take a lot more of these, and it's going to be less of an issue about it. Right, with that said, so what are you going to open with when you enter it? This beautiful decrease in Edict of Absolutism. Minus 0.25 monthly devastation. This thing is useless. I'm really sorry. Because even if you have a province where you don't want to build a fort that's been devastated like 60, and you want to like get rid of the devastation there, just dev it, because if you shove this edict on here, it's going to still take you 4 months to -1, so it's going to take you something stupid like 240 months. You're going to run an edict for 20 years to get rid of devastation in the province. If you need devastation gone for at any reasonable time frame, and this is for 60 devastation or even 100, just dev it. I mean, I remember in Lemon Mod and so on, I made a edict that gave you -1 monthly devastation, and I just gave that to everyone at day 1 to deal with devastation, because I made devastation worse in the mod as well. And it was very rarely used, to be honest, because it's like, okay, you sometimes use it to get rid of devastation, but even then, forts just kind of do it better. Yeah, this sucks. I'm sorry. There's no 2 other ways about it. It's a D tier edict. It's a D tier ability. No. That though, we move on to flexible rivalries, and we run into a very similar issue. A bunch of mods actually make change rival costs be free, and it doesn't really matter. You don't really spend that much of the game changing your rivals, really, at all. Yeah, and when you do, it's quite rare, and you can just spend the 50 dip on it. Or is it 100 dip? I can't remember. It's that bad because you never really change your rivals. Like, it's useful if you misclick your rivalries, but okay, you've saved yourself some Monarch points in a misclick. You know what else can save you Monarch points in a misclick? Burning the game if you're in single player. And if you're in multiplayer and you misclick, well, oops. Get someone to deck on you and make them end rivalry with you. Congratulations, you've saved yourself 800 spender. So, yeah, another D tier not the forts change rival, another D tier contester. With that though, move on to protecting forts. Could be somewhat useful. Just be careful to not rely on it too much, because you can get an unexpected fort build the moment you overcome your rival or move the borders around. But it can be somewhat helpful, especially with fort maintenance starting to add up. My issue with this is it used to be quite a bit better when there was significantly less bonuses to fort maintenance in the game. Now there's more of them just available, for lack of a better word. Especially for things like infrastructure ideas giving you fort maintenance reductions, and defensive ideas having it. So yeah, or even if you want to go theocracies, there's a -20% fort maintenance tier 1 reform, I believe. There's a whole bunch of ways you can really make your forts cheaper if that's the build you're trying to go for. So the fact that there is this ability here is a bit of a weird one, because if it's something you really want to do, you can kind of get it otherwise from other places. But it's still okay to pick up sometimes, and if you have, especially in multiplayer, a big enemy that you don't want to be fighting for a while, you can shove 3 forts on their border and be relatively content with it. So that's not bad in that regard. Sorry, by fighting I mean you're not planning on moving the border around for a while. So that can be somewhat useful in that regard. In single player though, I find it completely useless, because you're probably, if you're blobbing, you're probably already too big to have rivals at this point, if I'm being fully honest. I think it scrapes into C tier from the MP functionality, but for single player it's definitely a D tier on its own as well. Anyway, with that, we move on to efficient autonomy. Autonomy change cooldown. Theoretically useful, practically not. I very rarely use that, if ever, and the thing is with autonomy change, like, yeah, the cooldown for it hurts. Yeah, you want to be decreased in autonomy, but by this point, by 1610 in the game, you've probably been doing that already if you were doing that, so this doesn't achieve much goals. If you do need to desperately decrease autonomy quickly, if you're in a situation where you had a bankruptcy or whatever that increased it, or other situations like that, it helps, but it's not like it's that amazing. I think its potential utility also helps it scrape it to C tier, but that's about that. We then move on to harsh treatment. And this thing I'm going to be saying is actually pretty underrated for minus 50% harsh treatment cost. And the reason is that if you are in the age of absolutism or later, which if you're looking at this age ability, we can assume you are, harsh treatment does give you absolutism. And there's quite a few sources in the game now of decreasing harsh treatment costs even further. Even back in the day, before there was many modifiers added, where I'm talking like 4 or 5 years back, the default mission tree used to contain minus 33% harsh treatment costs. I think it still does, as one of the missions. So one of the ways you'd be able to get absolutism insanely quickly is rush into the... not rush, but when you enter the age of absolutism, you would take this minus 50% harsh treatment cost, you'd pop the mission for minus 33% harsh treatment cost, and you'd basically just burn like 100 mil points on randomly harsh treating the most random rebels out there. But what that would do is it would just print like 100 absolutism right away, and it's a very easy way of just farming a whole bunch of absolutism flat. Now there's better ways of getting absolutism, but I've also seen that even though there's more harsh treatment cost added to the game, a lot less people use it from personal experience compared to before. Maybe that's just different people I'm talking to, I guess, something of that nature. But I think it's starting to enter the underrated category, and I think that's honestly one of the better ways of getting abs fast. Like, if you need abs now, grab harsh treatment cost reduction. You probably have a bunch of rebels. Go harsh treatment a bunch of them. Look, it doesn't matter if you're harsh treating like a 10k stack. Abs is abs, so go ahead and do it. And you can make it incredibly cheap with this ability. Now, there's also a bunch of other sources that can make harsh treatment reduced even further. So it can kind of become a mini game where you've reduced it so much it actually becomes viable to basically not deal with rebels just by harsh treating them down to 0 every single time they kind of just peep. It's a strategy. It's more micro intensive than I'd like to, but it exists, so I think I have to mention it for that. And hence, for those reasons, even though I would actually say it's pretty underrated for its strength, I'd actually put it to B tier for its potential utility. With that though, we move on to the star of the show, of the entire everything, the thing that I mentioned as the Eu4 modifier, 5 admin efficiency. It doesn't need any fancy strategies, it doesn't need any fancy explanation. It just walks in there, it's 5 admin efficiency, it makes everyone happy. You love to see it. Who doesn't like administrative efficiency? Administrative efficiency. Go into S tier, go at the top, and just take your deserved crown. With that, we move on to absolute government, alien absolutism tick. It's not bad, does what it says on the tin. Helps you get that admin efficiency eventually ticking up, eventually becomes pretty useless as well. But it's a thing, it helps. If you want to also get the age ability of getting an IT absolutism ASAP, it can help you get there somewhat, but yeah, it's a thing. I mean, not awful, but yeah, like it's... I won't say that I end up taking it, but like, it literally hits a cap relatively quickly as well. So, it's neat. You can also get it from your crown land as well, plus for yearly abs, if you have high crown land, which you should be doing if you're going to be putting around abs. So, yeah. I think it's earned its way to around the top of C tier, because it doesn't give you... If you really need absolutism, the harsh treatment cost method is better, but it's still a nice workhorse modifier to some limited extent. So, top of C tier it goes. With that, we'll move on to the French absolutism, 30% max absolutism effect. Now, so the effect of absolutism comes to 30% admin efficiency. So 10% effect max effect of absolutism is an extra 3% admin efficiency. 30% max effect of absolutism gives you like 9% admin efficiency, which is really, really strong, right? It does mean that basically, as France, in this age, you can just print admin efficiency and then transition into revolutionary France to become an absolute monster. So, yeah, I mean, it's really, really strong. There's not much else to say about it. It's just not universally beloved as this, because you do need to be France for it. But, yeah, go take it and be happy. It's incredibly powerful. With that, though, we move on to Dutch commercialization, 33% trade steering. It's another money printer. I mean, you probably have a massive trade empire. That trade steering is going to make you absolute bank. So press the button, go make absolute bank. It's incredibly strong. It's a lot of trade steering. It's very powerful. And unfortunately, yet again, the SC is getting very crowded, but that's because we have a lot of competition today. Like, genuinely, I'm like trying to move these around, but like all of them deserve to be near the top, to be frankly honest. Like, the S tiers are the S tiers within their own right. They're S tier enough to not really care about the placement, for lack of a better word, as well. Then we have the Swedish recruitment. Very workhorse manpower recovery speed. It's a lot of it. It helps. Lets you fight a lot more aggressive. Lets you worry about manpower a lot less. I like it, but it has its limitations. Doesn't like it's not like admin efficiency where it defines your campaign. It just makes your life a touch easier. Very workhorse modifier. Definitely a solid B tier option to pick up, especially if you play Sweden. And then we have Manchu banners. Gives you 50% possible banners. Now, bear in mind, possible banners increases with the age. So when you get this ability within the age of absolutism, at the end of the age, you're going to lose the ability. It's going to lose 50% possible Manchu banners. But because you're in the next age, each age you're for each +1 age, you get 50% max manners. So you're going to get 50% max banners to be in the Age of Revolution. So Manchu banners kind of just last until the end of the game, if that makes any sense. And banners are a good unit, so much similar to the Sweden thing. This is a nice thing to pick up when you're playing as Manchu, but yeah, it's a thing. Anyway, that does conclude the category for the Age of Absolutism, and with that we move on to the Age of Revolutions. This one, again, can definitely build up for it if you can be bothered. If you're going for the 50 dev capital, that one can be a touch annoying if you're playing single player or deving, but it's an option. You should probably have a 3-star General Admiral by now. You're probably going to own and control these two origin institutions unless you play an MP, in which case you probably have the 50 development thing and Parliament sorted out by that point. You most definitely have Empire rank. Even if you're playing super tall, you're probably dev to 1k by the time you're in the 1700s. And then we begin with Anti-Revolutionary Zeal. If you don't have subjects, you don't take it. But if you do, it's really, really helpful at this point to start keeping your subjects loyal because they are going to get a lot of liberty desire from development, and this is quite helpful in that regard. It's not helpful for personal unions because they don't gain liberty desire from subject development, but like for every other type of vassal, this is very helpful, and I quite like it. Unfortunately, it's like liberty desire isn't much of an issue, and I guess it's somewhat mitigated by the presence of this modifier, but even without it, it's not that big of a deal to manage liberty desire. You can definitely just keep your colonies loyal indefinitely, for example. So it's kind of a weird one in that it makes something that's easier, but yeah, go into C tier and be happy. It's definitely not deserving of D tier, that's for sure, but I don't quite see it in B tier either, so C tier makes the most sense. Then we have Napoleonic Warfare plus fertility bonus versus Ford, absolutely busted. It's Napoleonic Warfare. I mean, if it wasn't busted, that would be an insult to the man himself. This thing is incredibly powerful. It's really, really strong. I mean, Napoleon's face... Napoleon, whatever you want to call his name. Well, Napoleon if you're English, Napoleon if you're French, I believe. Anyway, that's the whole accent debate. His face is literally the icon of the bonus, so yeah, it's really strong. Plus artillery bonus versus 4 is basically +3 siege on all your generals at this point, because you need artillery. This thing is monstrous. It really helps your siege. It's really, really strong. I mean, again, it just is another S tier ability. The S is incredibly crowded for this tier list, because a lot of these abilities are really, really strong. What else can I say? Then we have improved Force March. Multiplayer, it's absolutely amazing, because it lets you Force March into battles and get your micro in, and it's great. Single player, you're probably not going to bother force marching, especially me, I don't really bother, but it can be helpful in a crutch to try and make it into a battle or some other micro-related activities. At this point, though, it's quite late enough game where it doesn't really matter. If this was available earlier and force march was available earlier, this ability would be significantly stronger, but it isn't. So for me, this actually just barely makes sense to C tier. If it was a purely multiplayer list, I think I'll be putting it into B as well, because a lot of the time I find even in multiplayer, if something needs to be force marched, you'll burn the mill points for it. But this is just helpful in that regard. So purely MP will be B, but it's a combined tier list with C, a combined tier list with single player, and for single player, that's just dragging it up down significantly. Next, we have Unrestricted Conquest, which ignores scoring distance. That's quite nice. I like Unrestricted Conquest. It's a nice ability. It's a very similar thing to the transfer subject thing that we have in A over here. In the sense that it's just a pure utility tool, but it's a good utility tool. So for that reason, and because it just makes life a lot easier, just lets you grab the provinces you want, so on and so forth, I'll be putting it to A tier. No need to worry about like cause, bordering cause, and other things like that, though. Just go play the game and have fun and blob to your heart's content. Next, we have Naval Engagement. 20% global naval engagement. This thing used to be a Britain ability exclusive. This is now just available to everyone. I thought it was... no, I think Britain used to have that, then they got naval maintenance, and now that it's been nerfed even further. You can tell there's naval maintenance by the old UK icon, but we'll get to that in a minute. This thing is incredibly powerful for doing boats, and incredibly useless for every other campaign. Thing is, this is basically a win button for boats. Problem is everyone else gets it, so it's just mandatory for any kind of naval play. And because it's kind of mandatory for naval play, it's like crawling its way up in the rankings. It's also very helpful to grab this and basically get a free naval win over any AI or any player who hasn't. And so that utility is kind of pretty important in my opinion. But for single player especially, you really don't care, and I think single player is definitely a D-tier option. For B-tier, naval battles do matter a bit more, and by a bit more I mean definitely a lot more. So I'm kind of umming and ahhing between C and D tier, C and B tier, to be honest, for an overall ranking. But I think it's uselessness really in multiplayer, because in multiplayer you can just win naval battles by building up boats, and the AI, even if they had high enough quality to build your boats, tend to just be scared of engaging you and just let you walk in on them anyway if you just build like 1,000 heavies if you're going for a world conquest by this point. And if you're trying to world conquer and you're in the 1700s, you should hopefully have a country big enough to support like 1,000 heavies. So yeah, it's a very weird ability. I think it scrapes into C tier really by its marginal utility, but I think that's probably the placement for it. With that, we move on to 20% artillery damage from back row. Yeah, this is really good. It's great in single player as well because it helps you win the battles. It's a very consistent, nice, strong military modifier. It's going to be going into B tier. Next, we move on to, well, loyal subjects, or at least whatever if Prussia didn't jump the gun a little bit. With loyal subjects, you get another 25% liberty desire, but this time on specifically same continents. Suffers a very similar problem to anti-revolutionary zeal. It's not a difficult mechanic to manage, but it helps. It's there if you need it. Most of the time, you don't. So again, marginal utility option. We put it into C tier because it's technically useful, but in practice, not really. With that, though, we move on to Prussian discipline. This is the age where fire damage is amazing. And this gives you a massive decrease to taking it. It's an incredibly powerful modifier, and you should absolutely be running it if you're Prussia or Germany. Like, that's it. It's just really, really strong militarily. It massively saves a lot of troops on casualties. It helps you win a lot more battles because you take less casualties within them, so on and so forth. It's really, really good. What else can I say? It's just, you want this. Definitely on par with a lot of the other military modifiers for me. But because it's like specifically a Prussian military modifier, and a lot of Prussian campaigns tend to be built around conquering, and it's quite strong, especially compared to the other military buffs in this category. I'm quite happy to buff this one personally up to A tier, to be honest. But yeah, it's a thing, definitely, for sure. With that, though, we move on to the British fleet. So this thing used to be amazing because it used to be naval engagement. Then they made it still quite strong, but not that good, by decreasing naval maintenance. And then they finally nerfed it to naval leader fire. Plus, one naval leader fire is I believe it gives you max naval leader fire as well, though correct me if I'm wrong. But even then, it's a bit whatever, because I'll be honest, as Britain, you're winning all the naval fights anyway. This is completely redundant. And the buff it does provide doesn't mean that you can ignore the other British buffs. They're not. This isn't enough to win on your own, but you're already winning. So this is one of those bonuses where, like, you know, how do I best describe this? Like, it would be like saying that if you've taken economic hegemon, you can get 10% national tax. Like, by the time you've got economic hegemon, you don't care about 10% national tax, right? So it's a bit of, it's that kind of modifier where it's quite sad, to be honest. If anything, more like plus 5% national tax. But yeah, Britain bad in the case of the in the case of naval leader fire. So yeah, go into the D tier and be happy. Then we move on to Russian Empire for minus 10% in autonomy territories. That's a really strong modifier, especially for any kind of bombing campaign where you're using a lot of trade companies. And if you played a very normal Russia campaign, you're probably going to be trade companying a lot of Siberia, and this really helps you get more out of it. This is really, really good, and you should be running this. Yeah, absolutely grab this thing. This is quite strong, an A tier ability for sure. And then we finally have, and we finish off with, I would say last but not least, but honestly it's pretty least. It's 20% morale damage received for Austria or the Holy Roman Empire. Well, Austrian tenacity. Used to be like plus 5 dip rep for Austria, and that was a lot more funny, in my opinion. Very shame that it got changed into Austrian tenacity. Technically more useful. Unfortunately, morale damage received isn't that good in testing. For I think a couple people tested it. It's not that strong of a military modifier in the way you'd think it is. But it's still there as something, and it definitely is nice for staying in battles longer. A bit like the Prussian 20% fire damage received, but significantly less useful. I don't think it's as bad as a bunch of the other modifiers in C, but I think it's dishonest to put it any higher than the bare minimum in B. And with that, though, we have pretty much ranked everything here. But pretty much, I mean, we have ranked all of it. So that is all I have time for today. A big thank you to all the people that have supported me over at Ko-Fi, with a special thank you to Ark and Solar.